Hi, everybody. It's Mary Rowe from the Canadian Urban Institute. Really pleased to welcome you to another installment of City Talk. We are in Edmonton all week, which is a fantastic thing. We're doing residencies, virtual residencies. We wish we were there physically with our friends in Edmonton, but we're actually virtually there, meeting with all sorts of stakeholders and groups and experts and citizens and community groups and residents to talk to us about what's working in Winnipeg, what's not, and what's next. Sorry, not Winnipeg. Sorry. Big mistake. Never confuse Edmonton and Winnipeg. What's working, what's not, and what's next in Edmonton. And as you can see, we have someone from the mayor's office, Julianna Charchun, who's going to be talking specifically about a very particular topic that these other folks are gathered to start to wrestle with us. But I just wanted to acknowledge that we are actually physically in Edmonton. I'll leave this city talk and I will go back into live sessions with Edmontonians through the rest of the week. And then next week, we're doing the same live in Calgary. So it's basically Alberta all the time here for the Canadian Urban Institute, which is important. One of the reasons that we chose to go to Alberta cities first is that we had a strong sense that the cities there were this is pre-COVID, we're struggling with a number of challenges, economic downturns, all sorts of opportunities to reinvent and revitalize their economies into a more kind of diverse mix of things. So all sorts of challenges around climate and environment and diversity, a whole bunch of things. And I was with you, actually, I don't know if you remember, Julie, but we were together a year ago this week. And I really had a strong sense that we would start the national residency program in these two cities because of their prophetic value to the country, because they had a jump start in a number of these challenges. Little did we know that 4 months later, we'd be in a global pandemic. And so all of those lessons are turning out to be hyper important as we all struggle together and try to make sense of what COVID's impact is on our cities and what it's going to do to our ongoing in terms of what the future of our cities will look like. So just plugging that we're in Edmonton and that I hope you'll follow us on social media to keep track of all that work, because it's really informative and interesting. And so CUI coming to a town near you soon, we hope. So today we're talking about a really fundamental question which has surfaced again and again and again. We've been talking about COVID as a particle accelerator, making every disconnection or dysfunction in an urban environment either worse or more intense or quicker. And sure enough, powers for cities has to be something that is certainly something that I'm talking about every day, all day, and I know my colleagues are here too. And so we felt it was important that we bring some really studied, thoughtful expertise into the room to talk about what powers do cities really need, and how has COVID in essence, shone a really bright light on that. As you know, the Canadian Urban Institute's in the connective tissue business. We have constituents all across the country. I'm in Toronto today, and you can see I'm sitting here basking in sun, which I'm so happy to have in December. But it's the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit and Métis people across Turtle Island. Two treaties that were covered by here in Toronto, Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties, which were signed with multiple Anishinaabeg nations. And we continue to struggle with all of us together with what the legacy of exclusion looks like in urbanism, and how we continue to perpetuate that, and how do we need to change the way that we engage, who we're engaging with, who's leading, who's actually participating in remaking, reimagining, and revitalizing our urban environments. Really pivotal moment for us. And I think the pandemic has just made this so much clearer to all of us. Canada, as our cities go, will Canada go? And we're making that case in all the different domains in which we work. So joining us today, everyone knows that we tape these, and the video will be posted live for people to be able to refer to afterwards. So you can send your friends and watch in the middle of the night. We actually know a lot of people do, so that's great. We're also noticing lots of academics are using City Talks as a material for classes. And I think another thing we're observing is that we need a deeper bench, folks. We need more and more people engaging in what it takes to build a city. Planners, architects, designers, social workers, artists, business folks. And so the more that we can engage younger folks in this discourse with us, the better. And so if you can share a City Talk with a teenager in your life or a young student in your life, that would be great. And we are assisted by volunteers across the country, many of whom are students, who help us put these things together, write the summaries and all that kind of stuff. So if you've got bandwidth and capacity to volunteer with CUI, and particularly with City Talk, we'd love to hear from you. As you know, just email us at covidresponse@canurb.org, and we will be back to you with a really lovely task that we would be delighted to engage you with. So joining us from Toronto, Doug Earl, former journalist now and teacher and a longtime advocate on city charters and other kinds of mechanisms. Marianne Meed Ward, the mayor of Burlington, there she is. Richard Albert, he tells me, an unpatriated Canadian. We'll repatriate you somehow, Richard, who is from Hull and Orleans, and then eventually found himself in Texas, and there he has stayed. But as I said, we'll find a way to bring you back sometime, Richard, and whose lifeblood is thinking about constitutions. Just think about that for a moment, folks. Richard's a person excited about constitutions. And then Julianna Charchun, or Julie as we all know her, who is in Mayor Iveson's office and has been on the front lines, literally, well, she's been on the front lines managing COVID response. And I just want to acknowledge that we are aware that there are parts of Canada who are besieged by COVID. We took these conversations on early in April, cognizant at that point that many people were preoccupied keeping people and saving lives. And then we had a bit of a respite as we kind of acclimated, and now we're back into crisis mode. So I do not want to be insensitive to the challenges that the city of Edmonton, the city of Calgary, and different parts, particularly in Western cities, here in Toronto as well, are coping. So Julie, we appreciate you taking time as you're putting out all those fires to also come and talk to us about this. So I'm actually going to start, if I can, with our host, Julie, to talk about the perspective from a city like Edmonton about why do you need different powers? What is wrong with the deal you've got?
Thanks, Mary. And I want to acknowledge, I do remember that conversation that we had, and thank you for following through in spite of everything. It's wonderful to have you here in Edmonton. We really appreciate this spotlight on the city. I guess I'll start with what's top of mind, which is the COVID pandemic. And as we know, it's laid to bear a number of cracks in a whole range of systems. And one of those is sort of our municipal powers and tools and capacity. And so what we're experiencing here in Alberta, and I recognize it's not the same across the country, but here in Alberta, the ability for Edmonton and Calgary as examples to actually respond nimbly to this pandemic is very challenged. We have the power to enter into a state of local emergency, which frankly was written probably at a time that didn't consider a global pandemic, to be fair, but it gives us the ability to do things like cut down trees and move cattle without permission. But as you can imagine, not particularly helpful in this context. And I'm being a bit glib. There are a couple of things in the state of local emergency and our sole powers that might be considered useful, such as being able to limit the movement of people, for example. But that in and of itself, that power isolated without data, we don't have access to the data that the provincial government has, for example. We don't have our own public health independent advice. So we're really highly dependent on the provincial government to be making decisions on behalf of the city and on behalf of the whole province. And of course, there's inherent tensions in how they're going to take approaches, whether those are regional and whatnot. But I think what we're seeing now is, what you saw in Edmonton and Calgary, for example, over the summer was introducing mandatory mask bylaws in public spaces. So that was one thing that we were able to do, which I think was a really, really key step. The province here just recently followed up with mandatory masks in the Edmonton region in the workplace. But other than that, we're looking at, our businesses are saying to us, can you look at mandatory closure of some businesses, for example? Because the only way for them to access the recent federal top-up that was just announced by the federal government is if they are actually mandated to close. So, for us to do that, and this is just an initial look, for us to do that would require us probably to use powers in the Municipal Government Act that have never been tested for this purpose. And it puts us in a very precarious position legally to have to go there. So, frankly, we feel a little bit helpless at times, and it's really difficult. I would suggest to you for municipal leaders who just feel like they want to be able to do more to support business and to support individuals and stop the spread, but our powers are clearly very limited in this respect.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing is what we've seen. I'm going to come to you, Marianne Meed Ward, next. But the other thing that we've seen, Julie, is that municipal governments across the country, because you've had to, I mean, there wasn't, no municipal employee was standing on the corner of looking at a park that had homeless people in it, or a shelter that they couldn't keep COVID safe. Nobody was standing there saying, "Oh, well, whose jurisdiction is this again?" You know, we've all been watching it in real time. We have a whole program that I'm sure City Talkers have checked out, citywatchcanada.ca, where we track municipal government action in 62 cities across the country, because we wanted to see who was adjusting and all the things. You've had to just basically be a DIY government for 9 months, and then it's put you into a financial constraint across the country, even though you have different arrangements with your provinces. It puts you into a fiscally really tenuous position. And even before COVID, you and I have had these conversations long before COVID about there are particular challenges in cities that a municipal government understands better than anybody else, or working with your community. You understand better what you need. And the dilemma is that any resources that come to you, and often policies that you have to implement, are either drawn by the province or drawn by the federal government. And by the time they trickle down to you, they may or may not fit, right? So
100%. We're grateful for the Safe Restart Agreement that we finally got in place earlier this year. That was hard work. I mean, I think we were working 18-hour days, lobbying hard, along with everyone else. And frankly, mayors felt like, well, we understand that there's a whole range of stakeholders that need support from the federal government and the provincial governments. And we sort of tried to wait our turn, in a sort of respectful kind of a way. And in the end, it ended up being a bit of a fight. But truthfully, like our transit systems, it's just so apparent now that when COVID hit and we had to shut down transit and we had to shut down rec centers, we immediately, here in the city of Edmonton, we quite rapidly laid off a number of staff on a temporary basis, which helped to sort of stop the bleeding, but it wasn't enough and it won't be enough. And so, yes, we're facing across the country shortfalls at the municipal level in terms of our operating. And frankly, the Safe Restart Agreement, we see it as 1.0, and we're already talking to the federal government about what Safe Restart 2.0 is going to need to look like. Yeah. But the fact that we're in this sort of space of needing a bailout is, I think, says it all.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to come to you now, Marianne Meed Ward. I mean, the frustrating thing, of course, is that the cities needing a bailout is just kind of crazy. It's as if you're a stakeholder next to, the arts community or some other sector. And I think that's the dilemma, is that the federal government or even the general population would see municipal governments as kind of, well, get in line, as opposed to being an equal order of government, which is the focus of this conversation, which I'm going to go to Doug and Richard to speak on, an equal order of government. And that's the dilemma. That perception is not widely held. So Marianne, Mayor, tell us your perspective from a position of Burlington, and also just give people a little bit of a picture of what you've been coping with through COVID, and then why this discussion is so important to you.
Certainly. You touched on it, Mary. There has been a conversation that started a long time ago, and I credit Doug and the folks at Charter Cities for saying, look, the arrangement that municipalities have within the Federation really isn't working, hasn't worked for a very long time. And we're just now saying it can't wait any longer. And now that we have this pandemic, we have seen how devastating it can be. And Julie brings up the mask. I think that's kind of ground zero as an example of what really doesn't work. We did not, when we investigated early on, could we even impose a mask bylaw? The province wasn't doing it at the time. The federal government wasn't doing it at the time, but we were certainly hearing from our residents, do something. And that's probably the key thing I've heard throughout COVID is do something. And then we would bump up against, well, we actually don't have the power to do that. And so that's the essence of pretty much every conversation through COVID-19. But with masks, we said, well, we've been told we can't do anything. And then, but that wasn't good enough. That wasn't good enough for our residents, and it wasn't good enough for us. So we had to kind of twist and turn our way around, kind of torture and twist legislation, and reimagine and interpret it, because as Julia said earlier, it absolutely was not written even recently, but more importantly, it wasn't written with a global pandemic that comes around once in a generation or two. So we attached it to our business licensing, and I would credit places like Toronto for leading the way. Somebody had to sort of put a team of lawyers on it to see how we could do it, and we all just said, okay, if they've figured it out, we're just going to take that and do it. And so then there was this cascade, this domino effect in Ontario of municipality after municipality within days, just taking what had been vetted by another larger municipality with more resources. And really that should have two things: should have been led at a higher level for consistency. And eventually the province, about 2 weeks ago, got around to instituting a mandatory mask bylaw. But the other thing is, municipalities took that on the chin. Yeah. I can tell you, I had as many people sending me "what are you thinking" emails as I did saying thank you for protecting us. And that is also the nature of governing in a pandemic, that positions, views, perspectives in the community are very divided. And so there's an incentive for another level of government who has the power to act not to step into that. Let the municipalities wear that. Yeah. And so there was some of that too. But you look at, that's just one, trying to help our businesses out. We found a way to give them a grant program without running afoul of municipal bonusing. But we think we're on the right side of that. But again, we had to sort of creatively interpret the language. We sent letters to the minister saying, this is what we're doing. So, we don't think we're on the wrong side. So please don't interpret it that way. But it does really limit your ability to be agile, as Julie said earlier, to be fast. And speed is the key ingredient when you're dealing with a pandemic. You can't wait around. And we know what's best. We're hearing it from our residents, and we were really handcuffed. So I'm a silver lining person. I'm an optimist. The benefit that will come out of this is that the back burner of we need a new relationship for cities in the Federation has now become a very front burner issue, burning platform to say, no, we've learned for public health and safety and a whole host of other reasons. Municipalities need to be their own order of government, not something that, quite frankly, the province could eliminate with the stroke of a pen any day of the week that they chose to do so.
Yeah, I've been very blunt with my colleagues about this, that if we can, some people have been saying this for so long, cities need to be their own order of government. But if COVID sadly becomes the basis upon which you say, if we were our own order of government, fewer people would have died.
Yep.
That kind of level of discourse could happen. For instance, if you take housing, one of the frustrations that I have as a regular person walking on the street is that I don't know who to hold accountable for the fact that we've got so many homeless people on the street and that there isn't adequate housing. And if you try to hold a particular order of government accountable, you've screwed up. They will say, no, it's, and it's very frustrating to then, you can imagine from a taxpayer's point of view, then who do you hold accountable for anything? Right. And that's, I think, the moment we're at. Now, the question is, are we at a moment where we can start to have a serious conversation about AKA the C word, which is the Constitution?
Charter.
And that's right. And whether or not, charter, and what are the mechanisms? So I'm going to go to you, Doug, next, if I can, and then I'll come to you, Richard, for an academic perspective and give us some broader perspective around other practices. But Doug, you've been at the center of the charter movement, and you're not actually an urban planner. You're not a person who came up through the ranks. You're a regular guy.
Well, that's right. I was a journalist, but early in my career, I worked in the Northwest Territories during a period of time where the Northwest Territories went from a jurisdiction that was run by fiat, by a federal commissioner, essentially a deputy minister, to the point where it developed self-government. So I was a front row participant in that process, and I see a lot of parallels with what's going on in cities across the country as they come to terms with the lack of power that they have to do the things that they need to do. You know, it's funny in terms of COVID. There was a story here this week, or in the last week or so, where there was a restaurant in Etobicoke that had decided to resist the COVID restrictions and remain open. And there was a kind of a 2-day period where people wanted to do something about that, but they really couldn't figure out who was responsible and what powers people had. The city of Toronto, which is responsible, you know, in non-COVID times for sort of the health in restaurants, making sure that people can dine safely, wanted to close this restaurant down, but it found that it didn't have the power to do that it couldn't go to court and seek an injunction that would have caused the restaurant to close immediately. And what it had to do ultimately was go to the province and ask the province to go to court to get this injunction going. So it's just a little micro example of the kind of thing, you know, that folks are talking about here. And it's emblematic of this bigger problem that we have. You know, you ask what new powers cities should have, and the truth is that cities have no powers. So it's not a question that, oh, cities have some powers and they need more powers. It's that they don't have any. Under our Constitution, when it comes to municipal affairs, provinces have all the power and municipalities have none. So anything a city does in its day-to-day activities, any tax power or regulatory powers or enforcement powers, or even the ability to provide any program or service, they're wielding political power that's been lent or delegated to them by the province. And because that's the case, it means the province can also take any or all of those powers away at any time, or dictate how those powers will be used. Or in this new COVID wrinkle, they can decide not to assert their power and leave the municipalities on their own. So, you know, in Ontario, we've had many, many examples of this, particularly over the past couple of years, where the provincial government has slashed Toronto City Council. It's revoked the power of municipalities to use ranked ballots in their election. It's unilaterally changed the route of LRTs in Mississauga and canceled one in Hamilton. You know, it's reinstated old rules for land use appeals, using secretive, unappealable ministerial zoning orders to preempt local planning, slashed provincial contributions to municipalities. So it's certainly not just COVID, although COVID has showed this up, but it's right across the board that cities do not have the authority and the power and the jurisdiction they need in order to implement the responsibilities that they've been given. And that's why we are suggesting a city charter, which would write down what powers and responsibilities and authority and resources and protections a city would have. And then that city charter would in turn be constitutionally protected through a single province amendment that's very easy to get. And I can talk more about that, but that's the basic idea. That's the mechanism that we're suggesting in order to overcome this problem and give us a focal point around which we can talk about what powers cities need, and once they get them, how to protect them from being taken away by the next government.
Mm-hmm. I just want to acknowledge that there are lots of really smart folks on the chat box who have been active in this discourse for a while. Very happy to see all of you, lots of my colleagues here. Active in the city charter movement and city power movement and what's going to go on and how that affects digital and various things. But one of the points that people are raising is that, you know, a charter is a tool, but the charter can potentially it could be not well used, or it could have the wrong things in it, or, and I'm going to come to you, Richard, next, because the other thing is that I'm old enough to remember when the City of Toronto Act was being developed, and I think there are people who would say that there are powers within the City of Toronto Act that the City of Toronto has elected not to use. So that is a dilemma too. So Richard, I'm going to come to you. And I also just want to clarify for everybody, if this is a new conversation to you, charters and new powers for cities, just bear with us. But remember, people here are talking about city, they're talking about the municipal government. They're not talking about all the other actors that populate a city. We're talking about the municipal government when we talk about a city charter. Okay, Richard, over to you. Give us a perspective. The Texas Longhorn, I see that decal on the back of your wall there.
But do you see this though? This is what you have to notice first before that.
You have to really zoom in. What is that?
It's a maple leaf. It's a maple leaf.
Hello.
Well, thanks so much for having me. This is really exciting. It's an important subject. And, you know, one of the things that I've really been thinking about is how the COVID-19 pandemic has really put pressures on federal arrangements, not only in Canada, but around the world. And so if you just look at the worst hit places around the world, most of them are federations. And that's not a surprise because partly they're big populous countries, but in other ways, it's that there's tensions between the national government and the subnational governments, but also the municipal governments. And so there's a great tension that's being played out right now that's going to have to cause us to rethink the allocation of powers in multi-level governments, by which I mean federal systems and also the European systems where there's a supranational level of government. But back to the question about...
You're making me nervous there because I'm assuming that a republic is still a federation, I guess, and they're not doing so well below us. But I think what you're suggesting is that if there are multiple jurisdictions within a particular polity, within a country, this is where we're seeing difficulty parsing it out, right?
There are coordination problems. And those coordination problems are really exacerbated by the politicization of the crisis. Let me give you an example. So I'm now dialing in from Austin, Texas. And the mayor of Austin wanted to put in place a mask mandate. Makes sense. But the governor said, no, that mask mandate is going to be superseded by my executive order. Now, there was politics at play here. We've also seen this happen around other parts of the United States. In Mississippi, many cities sought to make social distancing ordinances law. And the governor said, no, we will not allow that. And so part of this is politics. Part of it is just how to manage the crisis in the best way. But the question about the Constitution is just so deeply and profoundly important. And here I want to congratulate Doug Earl on the work that he's doing at Charter Cities, suggesting the possibility of using Section 43, one of 5 different procedures that our Constitution in Canada provides to change the Constitution. I think it's a good idea. I just don't know if it's possible. So let me put another suggestion on the table for us to consider.
You need to explain what Section 43 is. Just remember, we got lots of people, including me, who don't know what Section 43 is. So just...
Yeah, absolutely. So there are 5 different procedures to amend the Constitution of Canada. And it's a really enlightened design because the harder it is to amend something, the more important that thing is. So for example, in Canada, if you want to do away with Canada's relationship to the monarchy, you have to get everyone in the federation to agree. Parliament and all of the 10 provinces. There's a question whether the territories have to agree or not, but the Constitution says all 10 provinces have to agree. This is the hardest procedure that we have in the Constitution. There's an easier procedure, which is Section 43. Section 43 allows changes to be made to the Constitution where it affects some, but not all provinces. And it can be a negotiation entered into between the government of Canada, represented more broadly in the Parliament of Canada, and the government of a province that then negotiates and then gets the approval of the Legislative Assembly of the province. So much easier to do than to get everyone to agree across the federation. And so Doug Earl and his group, I think quite rightly have made the argument that Section 43 is one way of creating this idea of a charter city. I think there are some complications to that. They're not unovercomable, but precisely because there are complications, I want to put another suggestion on the table that could get Doug Earl and what all of us here gathered think is a good idea, which is to empower cities to do things that are specifically targeted to their needs, the needs of their people and their residents. So here's an idea. There is no such thing yet in Canada as a provincial constitution, but they're possible. Our Constitution authorizes provinces to create, codify, and formalize their own constitutions. And in the process of doing that, you can imagine a province writing a new constitution and devolving powers to municipalities. You can do it in a one-size-fits-all way, or you can do it in a more targeted way. Toronto gets these powers and Burlington gets these powers. Ottawa, where I'm from, although I was raised in Orleans before amalgamation, gets these powers. That's another way I think of doing it. And the beauty of the idea, Mary, just 30 more seconds. the beauty of the idea is that there are many people around Canada who want the idea of a provincial constitution to come into place, because they don't necessarily want municipalities to get more powers, but they see other reasons why provincial constitutions would be a good idea. So what you have is a beginning of a coalition of persons. So in Quebec, for example, there's talk, and we're writing a book about why Quebec should write its own constitution. It helps to express certain values, the distinct society of Quebec. I'm from Quebec. All the while keeping Quebec within Confederation. Alberta is interested in this idea, by the way, of a provincial constitution. The Fair Deal panel discussed it in its report. And so you can imagine the possibility of doing precisely the things that Doug Earl and his group think are important, the things that Mayor Meed Ward think are important, the things that Julie think are important, and getting those things done without having to get the approval of the Parliament of Canada through Section 43, without having to run the risk of being held hostage in these negotiations. Let the Premier do it in consultation with the mayors.
Well, gee, thanks, Professor Albert, for just adding another layer of complexity into the discussion. Thanks very much. I just want to note that we only have an hour with us, and so this is, we're not going to remake the constitutional life of Canada in an hour, but but Massey College with CUI and other partners is moving on something in the spring that Richard's involved with, and I see that Alan Kapersky, who's coordinating that, is in the chat box. So if you've got an interest in this, you should find Alan in the chat. Alan, maybe put your email into the chat so everybody can see it. It's Alan Kaspersky. I can see him there. Put your email there so people can get in touch with you if they want to really get into the nitty gritty of this. You've added a whole nother piece. So question for the group, I guess. If we were to, I think one of the dilemmas we've had with this discussion is that it quickly becomes just massively overwhelming. And, Jane Jacobs gave a Massey lecture in 1980 called The Question of Separatism and raised the question of whether we should let Quebec separate. But her argument, if anybody wants to look this up, there are people on this call who know it better than me. Her argument was it would be better for Montreal, and that you would basically be freeing Montreal from the shackles of other kinds of relationships. So you're introducing a whole new piece, Richard, which is that the other alternative would be to let the provinces basically self-determine, right? And then and then I guess it cascades out, because one of the questions I'm interested in is that, Marianne, your city's quite small compared to Toronto or Montreal, that you see a charter as a vehicle potentially that would suit the size of your city, as well as it would suit the size of Julie's city?
Absolutely. And I think each one would be individually negotiated. And I love this new tool. Richard, thank you for that. I'm one of those people, if it's never been done before, then we should go there. We should do it. So that's like magic words to me. I'll be the guinea pig. Like, I'm happy to do it for Ontario, a charter or a charter city. And what we've discovered, we're just topping over 200,000 people, but one of the biggest issues, and where this first landed my interest years ago when I was a councillor for 8 years before being mayor, was on planning and development issues. We were constantly having our lunch handed to us by the local planning appeal tribunal, at that time called the Ontario Municipal Board. Unelected, one individual had never set foot in Burlington except for the hearing, deciding what our community would be planned like. And so I had started back then a petition to get rid of the OMB entirely and restore decision-making ability to a council. But through that conversation, figured out that that's just a symptom of a larger problem. And the larger problem is exactly what we're talking about, that municipalities can get overruled and they only have the powers that the province decides to give us. And so we absolutely, so that's one thing. Doug mentioned the municipal elections. We, the ability to choose your elections. What could be more important during a pandemic is having confidence in the way that you choose people to lead you. So that choice was taken away from us, of course. And then the other matter which has come up from time to time is revenue tools. Those are the ones that I think, Mary, you were obliquely referring to, that the City of Toronto has chosen not to act on because they're controversial. So why would you step into that space and that power? And so we all have to recognize that it's a double-edged sword, right? If we ask for more power, and we get it, and I hope we do, we're fully then accountable. There is no more of this, well, that's their thing, so sorry, blame them, go talk to your MPP. And I spend an inordinate amount of time explaining that to folks, and they just see it as a dodge. And I get it. I would rather have the ability to make the decision and be accountable and be unpopular if it came to that, rather than having to explain to people the limits of our power, that we really can't do these things. And then during a pandemic, spending an enormous amount of my time in advocacy. I write, I think, 3 or 4 letters a day to, instead of doing the work, I advocate to others about how it should be done. That's a huge time waster.
Oh,
You're on mute, Mary.
Thanks. There's conversation in the chat that Joy Connolly and others are leading, which is a question for all of you about rights. Because there is a risk, if we devolve more and more authority and responsibility to local governments, what's the guarantee that we have then that people's rights covered under the charter will actually be respected? I'm wondering, Julie, you just went through a big process in Alberta trying to get a charter for Edmonton and Calgary. How did you guys think about the rights question? Did you? And how do you think about it in terms of your experience locally there?
That's an interesting frame that I actually hadn't considered before. Let me sort of mull on that, and I can tell you a little bit about it, or I don't know if Doug wanted to jump in on that.
Well, Doug, why don't we get Doug on rights, and then I want to come back to Julie on the actual real life experience of trying to get a charter. Go ahead, Doug.
Well, when you have a city charter or whatever mechanism you settle on to give cities more power, and whatever constitutional method you use to protect it, at the end of the day, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms still applies. And so all of the protections that we have against a malevolent provincial government, and the way it might act in our individual lives, are there if a city were to act the same way. When you talk about power devolving to cities, you also have to talk about accountability devolving to cities. And, if you're going to give cities more power, then you have to simultaneously create mechanisms at the city level of oversight. So, auditors, ombudsmen, integrity commissioners, whatever it is that's necessary to make sure that a more empowered city doesn't have the power to just run roughshod over people's lives. I think we have now, since 1982, an established history of people's rights being respected by the courts, in fact, being strengthened, if anything, by the courts. And so I'm not worried about that. The other accountability measure at the local level is that if a city government begins to do things that people don't like, then they vote them out. And that's the ultimate accountability and protection.
Yeah, I hear you on that. There's a kind of an immediacy to that, but you can imagine people's apprehension, I guess, is the question. Are we?
Can I jump in on that one just really quick, Mary? And I think it's really important to say that we're not asking for new powers over people. We're simply saying which level of government should be vested with the ability to make those decisions. So it's not like we're asking for ways to contravene a charter if those don't already exist at the provincial level. We're just saying the province shouldn't be the ones that make those decisions. We need the municipalities, the mayors, the councillors who are the closest to the people. I will hear the second I walk out my front door into a grocery store whether people are happy or not. Try finding your MP and your MPP sometimes, because they're rightly in other places doing that work. So it isn't about new powers. It's about who should be making those decisions, and we think it should be the cities.
And just a quick point on that too, which is that right now we have people who don't live in the city of Toronto making municipal decisions about what goes on in the city of Toronto. So we have people who don't live here making decisions about land use, and they're for the built form of the city, the quality of life in the city. They're making decisions about transit. They're making decisions about how the city is funded and what happens with tax money raised in the city that goes out to senior levels of government. So right now you can say that there is no accountability for these decisions, because I can't vote against the guy in Timmins.
Who makes the wrong decision for you.
bringing that down to the city level is going to enhance protections, not cause problems that way.
And to be fair, the people in Timmins feel that Queen's Park is telling them what to do too. So there's a structural issue here and you can imagine this magnifies when you start to say, well, what are the decisions that are being made in Ottawa? Okay, Julie, let's hear some real talk from you about what the experience is in trying to hammer out a charter and what are the lessons you can tell us.
Sure. And just for a little bit of background, well, first I have to say, I just really appreciate all that commentary by my colleagues on the panel. It feels so true. And there's something very odd about this idea that local governments are somehow less accountable than provincial or federal governments. And that's probably a whole nother panel. I'll leave it at that. But that's definitely been a theme of the real experience of doing this. But so just to back up, prior to working in the mayor's office, I've been here now 7 years. And prior to doing that, I was working on intergovernmental files for the city of Edmonton. And specifically, we were working on city charter files. So I've probably been on this file here in Edmonton like a decade or so. I can think back, we've had 3 different governments that we've involved, multiple premiers under the PC government. Of course, there were several premiers there who were involved. 3 MOUs that I can recall that were signed that said we'll agree to talk about roles and responsibilities and have the conversation. Finally, we did engage in a really earnest and consistent way with when the New Democrats came into power. But near the end of the term, things really ramped up for that. Near the end of what ended up being the end of their time in power. It was about 10 months of intensive negotiations, I would say. Where we landed with that government was a fiscal framework, essentially, that tied our new infrastructure dollars. So instead of sort of our existing municipal sustainability initiative program here in Alberta, which sort of the provincial government says, here's some money for infrastructure and go do with it what you would like. For obvious reasons, the provincial governments don't really love that kind of a program, right? They don't get to celebrate or get credit for it. But in any case, we decided that what we wanted to do is we sort of saw the writing on the wall in terms of Alberta's economy, and we recognized that what we needed to do was probably take a position of getting less. And so what we did was we negotiated a deal whereby our revenues for infrastructure would be tied to the provincial economy, which is really, really important because it doubles down. It means that our what we get would go up and down depending on depending on provincial revenues. And I think the really important principle behind that kind of a move is that cities are, of course, really critical to provincial and federal economies, but there wasn't that very clear tie that made it that demonstrates that there's now an incentive for cities to participate in the provincial economy because we're going to see a direct return. So that was a really critical piece about that. In addition to that, we also negotiated a sort of a pot of money for our region because Edmonton is the central city in a very highly connected metro region. And we're and Mayor Iveson has been working very hard on this his entire time as mayor and before to really double down on ensuring that we have regional collaboration so that we're being super efficient and working together and making infrastructure decisions that are sort of good for the whole region, not necessarily just for Edmonton or just for one other municipality. So there was some money for that. There was also a large amount of money that was going to help us with the next phase of our LRT build out and for transit, which was highly significant. And then in addition to that, we got a number of policy and legislative powers. I will say that the list of powers, policy tools that we were looking for was long. The list that we ended up with was very short, and we'll see what happens with those. So anyway, this whole thing was legislated. It was a deal for Edmonton and Calgary. We had a provincial election. Obviously, we knew kind of where things were probably going to be headed. We were paying pretty close attention. We anticipated potentially a change in government, and we ensured that we had a commitment within the UCP, the United Conservative Party's platform, to maintaining the charters for Edmonton and Calgary. That is in their party platform. It was a commitment that they made. They won the election, large majority came along, first budget, city charters disappeared. And so the fiscal framework was gone. Then the new fiscal framework that's for all municipalities is not anywhere close to what we negotiated. And we were, and there was no engagement or conversation or even frankly heads up that was going to happen. So that's where we stand after about a decade of work.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of heartbreaking because it just illustrates exactly the point you guys are arguing for, that you can't, nothing will stick. You're there kind of operating at the largesse of your province.
Yeah, and I want to, sorry, Mary, I want to also say what I find, because I thought Richard's comments were fascinating, but I need to add into the mix here that the United Conservative Party, ideologically, one would assume, would align itself with the idea of subsidiarity. That was my assumption anyway. So this ideological inconsistency for us is really challenging, you know. And so if you can't make it work with a conservative government, what hope do you have with a different party, I would argue. Anyway, that I just want to put that out there. Thank you.
It's a Gordian knot, folks. I mean, this is the dilemma, because as you say, subsidiarity, the idea that you push down to the local community the decisions and responsibility and resources that to the community that's providing the service. That's a good small c conservative principle around self-sufficiency and self-reliance and all that stuff. The dilemma is the way that politics is done and the way electoral boundaries are crafted and the way votes are cast, and right? It's very tricky. I'm conscious that this is, we often say that we have parallel, City Talk is parallel conversations, one that's live here and then one that's going on in the chat, which is why we always publish the chat. So this session is going to really exemplify that, because there's a lot of really thoughtful commenting going on in the chat that I can't possibly weave in. They're into the internecine things of Section 5 and Bill 5 and Bill 2218. All of you, I hope you will get in touch with Alan and make sure you go to that Massey College thing where they're going to get into this in every deep way. And we'll publish the chat so people can look up those bills later and study up. Richard, you introduced this big hairy idea of a provincial constitution, but you know, can we talk practical for the last 10 minutes we've got on this session? You know, if you were these folks, if you were in municipal government the way Marianne is and the way Julie is and the way Doug is advocating, what would you advise them in terms of how they should spend their time?
I've been thinking and writing about
forward. Go ahead.
Yeah, I've been thinking and writing about provincial constitutions for some time. It's something we don't have in Canada, but that doesn't need to be the only answer. I think the Section 43 path that was put on the table a moment ago is a possibility. But the problem, of course, is that there are these vestigial memories of the dramatic failures of constitutional reform efforts in Canada in the 80s and 90s, the failure of the Meech Lake Accord, the failure of the Charlottetown Accord. And I just worry that that's going to hold us up in amending the Constitution. Now, the Section 43 strategy.
Yeah, but then why do you think making new constitutions?
Yeah.
Because you don't need the permission from anybody. The premier can do it.
But what we find here is that you're absolutely right, that's every time you say the word constitution, people say, oh, Meech Lake, oh my God, we'll never get it. It's going to take too many people. But in fact, a single province amendment has already been used 8 times since the Constitution was brought home in 1982. I'm not like Mayor Meed Ward, where if you haven't done it before, go there. I'm more like, well, if it's been done before, then the path is beaten, and that's going to make it a little bit easier to achieve what it is that we want to achieve. But we've got to get over, you're totally right, Richard, we've got to get over that that reluctance on people's parts to talk about constitutions or reopen the Constitution in any way. It's very easy to do. The federal government has already indicated privately that it would be open to an approach by a province and a city seeking a city charter to be constitutionalized. So we think it's not an overcomable thing at all to get that part of the piece done.
You know, in politics, we have these mental maps about what is possible and what is not. And the C word is in fact the C word. You know, people don't like to say it in politics, and that's because they have long memories. But Doug Earl is quite right that this Section 43 power has been used on 8 occasions since 1982. But I worry that things have changed since the demise of the Charlottetown Accord. And they've changed because now it's very likely that there will be legislative trading and log rolling. So you want this? Well, what are you going to give me for that? Oh, you're getting into this deal with Ontario? Well, Alberta will have something to say about that. Alberta's in. Well, what does Quebec say? And so the reason why the provincial constitution idea, and I don't want to try to sell it, I just want to expand our conversation. The reason why I think there's a strength to it is that it doesn't require the participation of anyone other than the provincial actors themselves, and it can be led by the premier herself. She can do it herself and create the constitution.
So Richard, let's talk for a minute about your home province, because urbanists are always keen on pilots. Like, can we try something? Can we do something in a modest way, in a limited space? And then if it works, fantastic, then government will take it on, or it will spread, it will become more popular. And I make this comment that we're now, every community is in a pilot. We're in the pandemic pilot now, but rather than having to say, oh, let's do it. I mean, to make it so big, could we find one environment where we could try it? Would Quebec, for instance, that already, the Quebec government already has a different relationship with Montreal. Mm-hmm. Could that be the area? And I can't imagine that there is an interest in a provincial constitution in Quebec. There would be probably enormous interest in that.
There is enormous interest in that. And in fact, a few years ago, the government of Quebec released a white paper on this very question. And so it's not kind of pie in the sky. It's an idea that people are actually thinking about, and it's there to be grasped. But of course, there's political will that must be had first, right? You have to assemble that political will, and politicians are conservative by disposition, not capital C, but small c.
It's interesting in our position here at CUI, you know, we hear you about political will, and we support the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, who does all the political advocacy. Julie is very involved with them in terms of how this FCM represents and advocates in the political realm. But we also think there's capacity at the staff level within these bureaucracies. Because I think there's lots of understanding in provincial and federal bureaucracies at staff levels where people have been working there for 20, 25 years. They know that there are limitations to the way the current arrangements work. And I'm curious whether that is also a strategy, is to work with bureaucrats and work with policymakers. The political stuff can go in parallel. Marianne, I'm interested, the piece you mentioned about whether we should be looking at regional charters versus.
I'll sign up right here for to be a pilot project, you know, so I'm putting my hand up, but you know, I think this is one, to Richard's point, where I actually think the public, certainly the public in my municipality, are ahead of the politicians on this. They are begging for more powers to be devolved to cities. They are ready for that. And as Doug mentioned earlier, if they don't like the decisions that their local elected officials are making, they can vote them out every 4 years, just as they can vote out the federal and provincial. So, but at the municipal, the beauty is it's you and your platform. You don't have the baggage, for better or worse, of a party banner carrying you, and sometimes literally carrying you through to victory, regardless of what you personally bring to the table. And so it's one of the reasons I love municipal politics, is that it is you directly accountable for your ideas, your policies, your platforms, your achievements to the residents. And they are asking for this. They put this in front of me a long time ago related to planning issues, but as we've looked at all the other opportunities, you know, and I've already been in discussions with our local member of parliament, our member of provincial parliament about this. And as Doug said, there is some willingness, depending on the path chosen. I really am intrigued by the idea of a provincial charter, but I do think that there would be opportunity for the federal government to really just approve what a province and a city has come up with. That's their role under Section 43. They don't even really have to do much except, oh, you guys have sorted something out. Sure, we'll give you the stamp of approval. And if you put it that way, it doesn't have to be a constitutional crisis.
Right. So I want to just riff on your last two comments and then ask each of you for something in closing as we end up the hour. And I wish I could ask everybody on the chat for a single comment too, because really they're having a hell of a time over there doing it. You know, I think one of the tangible questions is, will people's lives, will Canadians' lives be better? And will services be delivered to them more effectively if we were to see this kind of change? How would it materially change my life, whether I live in Edmonton or Calgary or Burlington or Toronto or Vancouver or Orleans? would we actually see the difference? Because I think that otherwise I worry that we'll spend another decade talking away about what we think we need. And in the meantime, we have all sorts of challenges. So Julie, I'm going to start with you. What tangibly would make a difference here to a regular person on the street?
I'm going to pick housing because it's topical.
Okay.
So you were asking earlier, Mary, about, who do I hold accountable when I see homeless people on the street? And you're right, people don't know whose jurisdiction that is. It's the provinces, by the way. But anyway, part of what we've seen this year through the pandemic, and because of also the economic conditions in Alberta, is just a very visible homeless population. And this has impacted everybody in our community. Folks who are frankly nervous to walk down Main Street, for better or worse. The folks who are living rough in our river valley in massive camps that have been set up in the city themselves, which is obviously dangerous in a whole bunch of different ways. Business and investors who may be interested in investing in our city and starting business see what's happening and feel less inclined to do so, quite honestly. So if we had the tools to do this ourselves, which actually in Edmonton, interestingly, if you've been following what we've been doing on the homelessness file, we've basically just been doing it.
We've just gone ahead and done it.
Yeah. And it's not our jurisdiction, and it's not what property taxes were meant to do, but we feel so compelled, and this has been unanimously endorsed by City Council time and time again. We have a moral obligation to do this. When it doesn't matter that the provincial government is responsible and that the federal government has the money, people expect us to do something about it, and we expect ourselves to do something about it. So I really believe, the Mayor Iveson said a little while ago, we could effectively end homelessness. And that's not a stretch at all. It isn't. We could do it. We're going to get pretty close, I think. We're really leaning hard on the federal government through the Rapid Housing Initiative and other bits of advocacy. And we're hoping that the province will come on board. But we could effectively end homelessness in this country. I think that's a pretty big thing and pretty meaningful. So that would be my example. And honestly, just with a few shifts, we don't even need a constitutional change provincially or federally to do it. We just need some alignment around priorities, quite honestly, and a few other things that we don't have a time to get into today, but I'll leave it there.
But what's interesting is that you're leading and you're dragging the other jurisdictions with you and saying, I'm close and we're going to deal with it. Okay, Doug.
Often the case.
From you.
Right across the board. It would result in better decisions, quicker decisions, less overlap, less duplication, less expense. Give you one quick example. In 2016, John Tory, the mayor of Toronto, goes to the premier of Ontario and says, we want to stop paying cops $90 an hour to direct traffic on our streets. Nothing happens for 4 years. The provincial government has to give the city the authority to do that so those traffic wardens can write tickets. It went round and round and round and round, and finally, last month, 4.5 years later, they were able to implement that change. That's nuts. It happens in everything cities touch. By clarifying the rules, giving certainty, giving predictability, separating out who does what, and letting the people who are going to do it have the power to do it, you're going to change things across the board.
Richard.
Just two short points. I've lived in 3 different cities in Ontario: Orleans, Ottawa, Brockville, and Toronto. They're different cities with different needs. And so I think it makes just good sense to say that cities should have the capacity to work with their residents and deliver the needs of the residents however they think is best. They're best suited to do it, right? This is a subsidiarity principle in action. And it's a theoretical principle that's actually been borne out evidentiarily to be a workable principle. The second and final point I'll make, and again, thank you for having me, this has been really just splendid, is that in politics, it's the art of the possible. Things become possible when you build coalitions. And think of the coalitions of people who are behind right now publicly the idea of a provincial constitution. You have Quebec soft nationalists. You have Quebec federalists who want to express their distinctness in Canada. You have, I've been in touch with some Albertans, a former minister who says this is a great idea to give more autonomy to Alberta. And then potentially we have Mayor Meed Ward and others who believe this is a good way to devolve more powers onto cities. And this is how progress is made in politics, is to build coalitions of those who might not otherwise hold hands, but because they see the possibilities of an idea to be used the way they think it be used, that's how things become possible.
Okay, last word to you, Marianne, very briefly, please.
Planning and development. We can make a decision about a development and it gets overturned. And who do you hold accountable? An independent tribunal that you don't elect. And so there is no ability to hold accountable, and all of the other things the panelists mentioned. And I do think cities are going to start just doing it, just like Julie mentioned. We have through this pandemic, and that's the way it's going to go. And we'll end up doing the charter, and then after the fact, getting it.
Interesting, you know, and just to close on this, when I was in New Orleans, I was there for the 5 years after Katrina, and one of the community leaders said to me that, you know, they realized they waited and waited for a period of time, thought the cavalry was going to come across the hill, and then they realized finally that no one was coming, that they were the ones they'd been waiting for. And she said to me, you know, we had to stand up, and we're not about to sit down. So I think that's the moment we have, folks. We're all standing up through COVID, trying to figure out what the new cities are going to look like. I appreciate very much Julianna and Doug and Mayor Meed Ward and Richard. Thanks for coming and spending a bit of time in your home country. We're back here on Friday for City Talk, this time specifically in Edmonton, and actually on Edmonton time. So 12:30 Mountain Time, 2:30 Eastern, 11:30 on the coast, West Coast, with Mayor Iveson, who you heard Julie mention, Mayor Given, and Mayor Veer, and Mayor Spearman from, so we'll have Edmonton, Grand Prairie, Red Deer, and Lethbridge, a powerhouse of municipal leadership and power from Alberta, coming to you on City Talk on Friday. In the meantime, we're going back to Edmonton. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for being so active on the chat. This is the last conversation. We're going to have lots more about powers for cities. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, bye-bye.